An archive for a corporation or an organization like a church is the result of a records management plan. When we started organizing the archives here at Trinity, we were really putting the cart before the horse. So what should have happened, and rarely does, a records management plan would give a church guidance as to what of their records that they normally produce in any given year would be considered of historical importance, and that it should be retained after a certain period of time. There's a fine line between archiving corporate records and becoming antiquarians. Antiquarians are very interested in all of the old stuff. Archivists are interested in the primary sources that tell your story. And those primary sources can at times be very technical, like the minutes of your vestry, or they can be much more ephemeral, like the press clippings that your church has managed to generate in its own community. It's an important distinction because it allows you to let go of some things. A classic point is when you're keeping financial records to keep the treasurer's records, but not to keep the canceled checks, regardless of whose signature is on the check or how charming that is. Those are the kinds of things that just become a bit of a self-discipline as you're saying, yes, we'll keep this, we won't keep that. This is the process that we went through, which is typical of any archive. I mean, this was what we did here at Trinity. This is what they do at the National Archives and Records Administration in Washington, D.C. Same thing. The acquisition is the first step. And here, the acquisition was records that had been kept and stored in filing cabinets in the basement of the rectory, in the office of the rectory, in a safe in the basement furnace room of the church, various other places. And that's very typical. I've done more than one of these church archives. The acquisition at this point is what you have and what you would like to have. So the importance of a records management plan is that it allows you to look at what tells your story and make sure that you're always collecting those things and that it does not just stop within the first 3 decades when everybody's enamored by pre-Civil War records. We are all making history. As we sit here, we're making history. And you want to document that. So the kinds of things that are being documented throughout your early history will also tell a story in your current history. After the acquisition, there is a process of conservation, if necessary. In some cases, that's beyond the scope of amateurs who are dealing with it. For instance, papers that have become damaged that need to be conserved. But for the most part, it's just taking care of photographs, putting photographs in archival plastic sleeves, making sure that your press clippings are photocopied because the paper on which newspaper is printed is very, very fragile. And those kinds of things are easy to do. In addition to the conservation is refiling things, taking them out of old manila files and putting them into archival safe file folders, and then storing them in archivally safe boxes. The gray boxes that you're going to see are typical of what you can purchase online. You don't have to be an institution to buy these things. And they come in various sizes and they accommodate both legal size and letter size and ledgers and all sorts of things. From the conservation, you go into arranging. The arranging is making some sense out of what you have. If it comes to you from a filing cabinet, it's called the original order. And if that can be preserved because somebody had a really good church secretary, then you preserve that. If it's just a jumble in a box, you need to take some initiative and arrange it in a sensible way that puts it in chronological order, sometimes puts things in alphabetical order. The type of record will help you do that. And if you look at the inventory that we've generated from our effort here at Trinity, you'll be able to see the kinds of categories that you end up with. When you're arranging, the common term that's used is record series, meaning that the records in a series are related to each other. And they're usually named, for instance, administrative, vestry minutes, parish records, whatever comes from those records. You needn't make up a name for them. They're usually pretty self-evident. From the arranging, an important part then is describing. The descriptions end up in formal archives as a finding guide. Finding guides can be very brief. They can be computerized. Finding guides are now on OCLC, which is what libraries use to categorize books. We have a finding guide that we're generating here that we plan on, with the vestry's permission, putting on the website of the Mineral Point Library Archives website. All of the finding guides from the Mineral Point Library Archives are on there. And in this day and age, it is a website that was generated specifically for small museums and archives, meaning that it is now searchable by Google, and we needn't go through all of the process of putting keywords and those kinds of cumbersome things. A researcher anywhere in the world would be able to look at small churches, pre-Civil War, lead mining, and they'd come up with this finding guide. The finding guide is a document that is simply generated in Word and is scanned in, and once it's up, it can go out as a published document that is, as I mentioned, searchable by Google. So there's no cost to us at the library archives. We already pay for the website, which is very minimal because it's specifically geared for small archives. It would be a way to do it. The other way would be to try and keep somewhat closer control and simply have a finding guide here with the records of the rectory, the vestry, whomever. And if somebody out within or without the parish was interested in the contents of this archive, they could simply sit down and read that 4 or 5 page document, most of which is a box inventory, and get a sense as to whether or not there's possibly records there that would answer their questions. That's the gift that a finding guide tries to give, that somebody doesn't have to sit down with all of the boxes and go through everyone. You can sit down with a document and look at it and have a pretty good guess as to where your questions might be answered. The finding guides that are generated can be just as simple as the dates that the church was founded, so you would know a context as to when the church records would in fact be on the ground, and a box inventory where you put, you just take these boxes and say in box 1 there's this, 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 and this, and that all becomes record series 1, administrative. In our case, we're doing the more complicated one, which is we have provenance, which simply means where the heck did they come from? Who generated these records? Who kept these records? Has there ever been any time when the records left the church or the rectory, and therefore these might not be complete records because somebody still has something at home in the garage? Then a statement, which is an organizational history of the church, which puts all of the records in context. And there are names and dates and various events. Then there is something called the scope and content notes. And scope and content notes are just what it sounds like. What's the scope of this collection? Does it include your parish records, your ministerial records? Does it include photographs? Those kinds of things. And you'd go through each record series and describe in narrative what the researcher might be able to find. And then there's a box inventory, which is just what it sounds like. Each box is inventoried and presented, with each file folder being named and the date span of that file folder's contents. Now, as an archivist, we're trained to know not only how to conserve, arrange, and describe documents of historic significance, but our fundamental charge is to make these available. And that's different as a public institution than what a private institution like a church may or may not want to do. The records here are clearly of interest to historical researchers, sociological researchers, theological researchers, but that would also mandate that you have some sense of how a researcher would be received here, where they could work, who would oversee their research, a physical person must be there while somebody is using your records, those kinds of things. And that can be burdensome for a small church. And what we did in a small church in northeastern Iowa was where we had an equally magnificent group of records. We photocopied everything. The photocopies stayed with the church for their own internal uses. The actual documents went into the County Historical Society archives that were housed professionally in the local library as part of an effort through a local college that was located in this town. So anybody who was looking at the bigger picture didn't have to bother the church and make an appointment there. They simply went to the local archives and accessed the records that way. So there are a couple different ways to skin the cat. It depends on how people feel. One of the issues that everybody in a church will have to overcome is that information is power. And it has always been an issue with how you let go of that information and if you let go of that information. I would certainly urge any of the churches interested in doing this to take a deep breath and realize these are records for everyone to access and for everyone's future use. And nobody loses anything by letting someone see them. That leaves you with access as the final thing, and what we just discussed can be very problematic for a small church. And that's something that you need to discuss as, I think, up front. Even though when it's all said and done, and people can now look at the archival work that has been done here, most people are saying, oh my word, I had no idea. This is really quite spectacular. And yes, it would be nice to be known as a place where people other than our own vestry, other than our own Sunday school teachers, other than our own priest, would be able to find information of scholarly interest, of intellectual interest, of historical interest. So that's the final step, and that is yet to be completely addressed with this set. We have more records that we have found, and in the course of this, a parallel set of records was being kept by the Women's Guild. And when they saw this and were no longer threatened by who I was I coming in here to take these records? People have come along to the idea that, boy, Jane was right on the spot, and this has actually been a good idea, and thank goodness we have a trained archivist here in our strange little community who was born and raised an Episcopalian. So all those kinds of things came together. And it was a way of everybody just saying, if we could just do this for a little while, I think you're going to be okay with the process. I think you'll see the product is well worth the effort. And everybody has felt that way. Now what happens is we find a safe place to store it. We figure out who and who cannot see it, and If there's anything this finding guide can do to help another church, so be it. When we began, we were told that the initial archives were stored in a fireproof safe in the furnace room. And that was all well and good, except the fireproof safe didn't have proper air circulation, and so it had already begun to mildew. So in here is the fireproof safe. This is where they were. This is the safe behind this clock. And they were inside there, and they were not organized. They had not been categorized. They had not been refoldered. So we got them pretty much as they had been created, and they were just stuck. This is not the best place for things. If nothing else, the chance of fire from a furnace, from a water heater, it really is not the safest place for your archives. But it's a pretty classic place for people's archives. This is what we've accomplished in the last year and a half. The gray boxes have been temporarily labeled, and you can see they're identified by record series 1, Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, and then the box number. The temporary post-it note labels are because things develop as we go through this, and so we're always refining and modifying the entire collection. These pieces were found in various places. Each box now holds the vestry minutes with a date span of what's inside each file folder. The file folder is archival, so everything that's in here is in an acid-free box and an acid-free file folder, and it stabilizes acidic papers somewhat. So this content goes throughout all of these boxes. The larger ones have to do with ledgers and the kinds of records that one would, one would expect to see in treasurer's reports and those kinds of things. We still are finding records in the basement of the rectory, and so we're going to continue to bring those online. And then we're hopefully going to work on the Women's Guild. The Women's Guild records are kept separately from the Trinity church records, and we'll do that as well.
Date of death.
And the date of death, if you look at the 1849 and 1850, that's the color epidemic. This is Dr. David Ross, and he and his brother came from Northern Ireland. They're Ulstermen, so they were Protestant Irish. And he, along with 2 other doctors in town, were tending to the cholera victims, and he came home and was dead within 5 hours. And his wife at the end, Margaret, died the next day, along with one of their small children. And then just to the left, Margaret's sister, who was living with them, also died. The children, the 4 children that remained, were all under the age of 10, and they went to live with their Uncle John, and who married another one of Margaret and Anne's sisters, and raised the orphans and their own children. And they were, this was what you had to do in those days, and it was tragic because it was treated in exactly the opposite way it should be treated, as a disease. And so it was recommended that you not drink, whereas of course what was happening was this massive diarrhea and dehydration, and so your kidneys shut down and you died. sometimes within hours. And if people had kept hydrated, which they do now, even without antibiotics, you would have survived. So it's just tragic. Matilda was quite a gal, and when one of the 3 forts during the Black Hawk War were founded just down the block, it was on Matilda and John's land that they gave for this purpose. And the men were out doing one thing and another, and everybody said, well, we don't have anything to worry about because Matilda's in there with a gun. So we're fine. And she was quite a character and ran the first boarding house in town, and she and John and their children are all buried there and had Episcopal burials, and I just don't know their involvement in the church.
It sounds like there is a history of women, or a feminist history, that needs to come out of this area. Between those stories and what James was talking about, it'd be great to sort of uncover the things that women were doing, the power, the way they found power and influence and things like that.
I think so. The stained glass windows that came up are all 3 of them are associated with the house across the street from where I live, the Cobb Mansion. And Laura Cobb was a pretty no-nonsense gal, and as were her children. Her husband was a self-made millionaire, and she was very influential in town. And her eldest daughter, who stayed here in town and married the chap who's on the bronze plaque, that's her husband. Clara was also married. Started along with Caroline Strong, Moses' wife, started the women's group that then led to the founding of the library here in town, and the public schools, and I mean, there really were just a bunch of kick-ass women in town. But it was, and some of them were just astounded. I mean, they had come from lovely, genteel Bostonian lives to the middle of really nowhere, as Jim said. There were trees, there were holes in the ground, there were Indians walking the streets, and these women just buckled down. So this is it. We're going to make this happen. And about a third of the burials here are Cornish immigrants. About almost half are either Cornish immigrants or first generation Cornish. But the church was an interesting focal point for a number of different things. Many of whom became very wealthy, all of whom were self-made for the most part. I mean, very, very few of them came with money in their own pocket. One of the things we're trying to do with this is the 6th year we've been working on restoring this cemetery. Nearly half of what you see here was lying on the ground 6 years ago, buried. You couldn't even see them. So what we've done is, a friend of mine who's a cartographer has done a digital map, and we're getting QR codes on everything. Once we determine that these are all the graves we can restore, we can't do anything else. The QR codes will allow you to click on person, and the Library Archives is hosting part of that website, and a biography of the person will come up. And then sometimes we even have photographs of them, certainly photographs of their homes or something. So that's going to be something that we're hoping this will be a way of interpreting the early history of Mineral Point.